Welcome to the Set to Lead podcast, the online mentoring platform for emerging and current leaders. My name is Marianne Samdi, leadership coach and talent development expert, and I will be your host. Today's show is going to focus on leadership and legacy. But before we get started, let's share your special background with our listeners. I know you've got a very interesting background.
Sure. Well, I grew up in an Air Force family, traveled all over the world, went to Purdue University and on an Army ROTC scholarship, spent 30 years in the Army, then 6 years in the private sector, and then rejoined the federal government, this time with the Marine Corps as a member of the Senior Executive Service. I am about to transition again, going back to the private sector. I'm moving from Hawaii to South Carolina, and I hope to be a speaker on leadership and life lessons. About a year and a half ago, my wife indicated a desire to move back to the mainland because we were just too far from family. And so I started reflecting on what to do with the next chapter of my life. And somebody told me that if you want to be a speaker, you need to get some video. So I didn't have any, having spent much of my time in the federal sector in the Department of Defense. And this lady told me she would set up a television interview for me. So she did that. And last summer, I took a trip down to Honolulu and spent 30 minutes in front of a camera with an interviewer talking about leadership. When we got done, the lady said, you had some absolutely fascinating stories. Have you ever thought about writing these down? I'm not sure what she meant. She said, you should write an article or a book. And I thought a book was a little imposing, so I wrote an article. It was about 14 pages long, floated it to a number of people, and half of them said, you ought to turn this into a book. And so I finally did decide to turn it into a book, and that's the result of my book now. It's called Leadership, the Art of Inspiring People to Be Their Best. And so that's really the first step in my journey on this next chapter of my life, was writing this book, and now looking forward to, in just about 30 days, launching off into the next chapter of my life.
Interesting background, Craig. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm sure your book speaks about many different aspects of becoming a better leader. Hopefully, I believe your book also talks about legacy.
Yeah, it does. Actually, there's an entire chapter on leaving a legacy.
Okay. So often people think legacy is about leaving valuables when you die, things like material wealth. What is your take on that definition?
Well, I think that's a bit superficial. I mean, people need to be remembered by what they contributed while they were on the earth. And, you know, the material wealth isn't really something I think that has great lasting value and a legacy that you necessarily want to leave. My chapter is all about leaving something that is a value, not just to people in your family, but to the world itself. Mm-hmm. So what I tell people is, you know, what I hope that my legacy will be, that I was able to pass forward or pay forward 50 years or more of leadership and life lessons that I had learned along the way, both good and bad, because I've experienced an awful lot of things in my life, and I think some of them might help others. So if you can leave a little bit of yourself to others when you leave the earth, I think that's the greatest legacy you can probably leave.
It's interesting you said that leaving something behind doesn't necessarily have to be all good when it comes to your experiences. So your failures can be part of a legacy experience too.
Absolutely. I tell people life is like a journey. You're walking along a path and there are rocks in the path. So you look down, you pick up the rocks. Some are good, some are bad, and you put them in your rucksack and carry them with you for the rest of your life. Then when you encounter situations, you can pull these rocks out and say, you know, I really remember watching somebody that I really admired, and I've got one of their rocks in my rucksack. I'm going to pull it out and replicate that. Or, by contrast, I really remember something that was really not so pleasant in my life. I'm going to pull that rock out and make sure I don't do that again, make sure that I don't repeat it. So I've got lots of rocks in my rucksack that I've carried with me in life. Some are good, some are bad, and I make no bones about borrowing from others, if you will, to take the best of breed practices that you've seen from others and pay them forward.
What leadership legacies out there have inspired you the most? Any rocks in your bag that inspire you?
Well, I once worked for a 3-star general who was a consummate gentleman. He never raised his voice. He was very, very bright, very capable. And I had a colonel come up to me one time and say, General so-and-so is the toughest guy that I have ever worked for. And I didn't quite understand exactly why he meant that or why he said that. So I asked him why, and he said, the reason is because I never wanted to disappoint him. Mm-hmm. And I thought there's no greater compliment for a leader than to inspire people to follow you. And here was an example of a colonel who woke up every morning hoping that when he went to work, he would do his best for not just the organization, but the general that he worked for, because he really wanted to make him feel like he was contributing to the team. That to me is inspirational leadership, and I would hope that I was able to do that at some point in my life as well.
So it's interesting, this gentleman that you're speaking of had such a presence that he never raised his voice. That's what you said. So if he never raised his voice, what did he do to get people to pay attention?
Well, if something didn't go right and somebody had done something wrong, he might say something along the lines of, that's really disappointing, or I really expected more, or something along those lines, in an even-keeled voice. He didn't have to raise his voice, because people, it's like a small child who has great respect for a teacher or for a parent or for a big brother or a big sister. And if you disappoint that person, it makes you feel really bad. I think most of your listeners can relate to that. I'm sure all of them, as have I, as have you, have had people that we have been around that we respect tremendously, and we never wanted to disappoint them. And when we did disappoint them, it made us feel really bad. A lot more bad than if they would have just yelled at us.
Right. Do you believe in journaling and self-reflection as a path towards nurturing great leadership skills?
Yeah, absolutely. When you say journaling, do you mean writing down what you've done? Or?
Writing down your thoughts of what happened during the week or during the day, your achievements, your thoughts of what you could do differently or what you've learned with the experiences you've experienced?
Oh, sure. We're all imperfect vessels and always room for improvement. So people have different approaches, obviously. I don't keep a journal, but I do write things down to remind myself. This book is an example. The book I wrote was let me reflect back on 50 years of life experiences and write down what went well, what didn't go so well, and what I learned from that, and pass it on and to others. So in a way, though the book is not a journal that I keep for myself, it was intended to reflect on those things that have worked well, those things that have not worked so well, and to pass them on to others. It accomplishes pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, of course. So when someone is in the process of self-reflection, and I think everyone should have a moments during the week or moments during the month that they self-reflect, are there a few significant questions, they can ask themselves about how they influence others? What are some key questions that should go through everyone's mind every so often?
Well, let me answer that in a little different way.
Okay.
When I was 20 years old, I attended the Army's Ranger School, which is really the premier training course and leadership course that the Army has. And part of that course included a peer review. And we had to evaluate each other throughout the course. And if you didn't measure up in the eyes of your peers, you didn't graduate. Peer reviews was a significant part of that course. Now, that was when I was a second lieutenant in 1973. Flash forward to 1996, which is 23 years later, and I'm a brand new brigadier general. And this was the first time in 23 years that I had experienced a similar kind of thing. The Chief of Staff of the Army sent out a survey once a year to each of his general officers. And for all 1 stars and 2 stars, you were required to answer 3 questions. Mm-hmm. The first was, do you know this officer? Because there was a list of your contemporaries on that sheet. Yes or no? And if the answer was yes, the next question was, do you recommend this officer for promotion? And the next question was, do you recommend this officer for command? And those are the only 3 questions that were, and you went down the list for each of your contemporaries. When I was a brigadier general, there were about 90 of us, I think, that I had to do this for. And when I was a major general, I think the number was around 50 or so. The results of that survey went back into the Chief of Staff, and he used that to make assignments and determine who would get command. So in a 30-year career, I experienced what we will call 360 evaluation or peer reviews only twice. And that was when I was in Ranger School as a brand new second lieutenant in 1973, and then when I became a general officer in 1996, and each year thereafter. I think having the ability to understand how others view you is incredibly important. Now, when I rejoined the Federal Service in 2010, I became a member of the Senior Executive Service. And Senior Executive Service members are supposed to take a 360-degree evaluation every 3 years. It's an opportunity for you to reach out to peers, to subordinates, to your boss, and have them assess what your strengths and what your weaknesses are. And I think that's very important. I attended a course about 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, and it was a small course focused on corporate CEOs, chief operating officers, CFOs. There were 12 students in the course. I was the only one from the federal government. Everybody else was a CEO, C-suite individual. And they had this peer review done, this 360-degree evaluation done before we attended the course. And then when we walked in on the first day, they had the results reflected up on a board. And you could walk up. They didn't have any names associated with them, but you could walk up and see the graph of how people were evaluated by their peers, by their subordinates, by their boss, compared to how they viewed themselves. And that, I think, is very important. When you look in the mirror every day and you say, this is me, who am I? It's just as important as how others view you. And these kinds of tools are important in that they give you the ability to step outside, turn around, and look at yourself in ways that others view you. And then you can make corrections and improvements on those things that you discover might not be the best.
Right. So, Craig, let's say there's a lot of organizations out there that don't give people the opportunity to do a 360. If you're in an organization where there is not a 360 process, are there some other ways or questions you can ask yourself to figure out if you're on the right track?
Well, you can certainly look at results. What kind of results am I achieving? What kind of results is my organization achieving? But then I guess just as important is how are we achieving those results? Because there are a number of different leadership techniques which might achieve the same level of results, but they're done in either positive ways or destructive ways.
Yeah.
Some people have a very difficult time seeing the reflection in the mirror, and do need outside consultation, outside observation to see how they operate. But clearly, if you can do the reflection, look in the mirror, to use a metaphor, and say, how did we get this ball across the goal line?
Right.
Was it done in a collaborative, cooperative team effort? You could certainly ask your team for feedback. What do you think? We had a thing in the Army called after-action reviews, and I think that's an incredibly valuable tool that we introduced in the early 80s. When you do a training event or you do an operation of any kind, the Army, the military in general, the Marine Corps and the Army in particular, often will do an after-action review where they say, okay, we just went through this process to achieve this particular objective. How did we do that? What did we do well? What did we not do so well? What can we improve on? And one of the first things we encourage in the Army is to have the leader stand up first and to admit to the group those things that person did wrong, and then solicit the input from others. So the after-action review process, I think, is a tremendously powerful tool that people and organizations can use to reflect on what did we just do? How did we do it? Did we achieve success? Was it done in the best possible way? And if people incorporate the after-action review process into their daily life, into their work, into their relationships, even if it's done subconsciously, it becomes like muscle movement. And I think it helps improve things.
Right. Sometimes I think you have to get out of the way and create more leaders to sustain your leadership legacy. How do you identify emerging leaders in that case?
Well, you can certainly solicit input from other people. Who on the team is contributing. I agree with you that getting out of the way, because you need to nurture the next generation of leaders and make sure that they're ready to take over from those who are the current day leaders.
Yeah.
After-action reviews is a great way of pulling out of the group who the emerging leaders might be, and then nurturing them. There's a chapter in my book about let's see. We've got a number of people who, let me look here real quick.
Okay.
Mentoring. I've got chapter 3 is titled, Are You My Mentor?
Yeah.
And I believe that there are a number of different kinds of mentorships. Certainly, one of the ones I found most valuable in my life is what I call virtual mentorship.
Okay.
And it goes back to the story I told earlier about picking up the rocks along the path, both good and bad, putting them in your rucksack, and using the good and discarding the bad, or making sure you don't use the bad. But mentoring other people is incredibly important to ensure that the next group of leaders are ready for the task when you're ready to sundown, if you will.
Right. Well, that's the end of our conversation for today. It went by pretty quickly. Before we end our dialogue, let the community know how is the best way to follow your work.
Well, I have a web.
What is the best way to follow your work?
Probably on my website. It's www.craigwhelden.com. I tell people it's Whelden, not DON, because oftentimes people will misspell my last name.
Okay.
So it's Craigwhelden, craigwhelden.com. I think people who visit that will get a window into my soul, if you will.
Mhm.
There's much about my book. There's much about myself. There are videos, podcast sessions, links to both the print and the audio book. And there are over 20 testimonials from people who know me well about both me and my book. So I think that's the best way to follow what I'm up to. Getting an opportunity to speak to groups is something I always look for, and you can find me on my contact page. It's info@craigwhelden.com. I'll be moving to South Carolina, but the virtual world, you can find people almost anywhere, and you can find me online. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm open to invitations and new contacts on LinkedIn. I'm easily found there as well.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for stopping by today.
Well, thanks. Thanks so much for the invitation.
You're welcome.